My father leaned close enough for everyone to hear and said, "You can't come tonight. You'll embarrass us." It was my brother's engagement party, white tablecloths, champagne flutes, and a future my parents had rehearsed for weeks. I stood there in civilian clothes, my dress uniform still folded in the trunk of my car, while guests laughed behind the door. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I nodded once and stepped back into the cold. What I didn't know then was that before the night was over, someone inside would see my face in a framed photograph and shout my name followed by the word General. My name is Claire Morgan, United States Army. And the night my parents decided I was too much of a liability to be seen, I learned how fragile their idea of honor really was. The call came earlier that afternoon, just as I finished pressing my civilian dress. I'd chosen it carefully, nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. The engagement party wasn't about me. It was about my brother Daniel and the woman he loved. That's what I told myself as my phone buzzed on the counter. My mother didn't bother with pleasantries. "Claire," she said, her voice clipped, "we need to talk about tonight." I already knew what was coming. I'd grown up learning to hear it in the pauses. "Okay," I said. "What's wrong?" She hesitated, then handed the phone to my father. He cleared his throat the way he always did before saying something final. "Your brother's fiancé comes from a very particular family," he began. "Old money. Expectations." "I know," I said. "I'm happy for him." "That's not the point," he replied. "They have standards. And you," he stopped, searching for a word that wouldn't sound as cruel as it felt. "You don't fit the image." I leaned against the counter, feeling the cool stone through the fabric of my sleeve. "I'm his sister." "Yes," my father said, impatient now. "And tonight isn't about siblings. It's about first impressions. You showing up well, it could complicate things." "Complicate?" The word landed harder than embarrassment. "I won't stay long," I said. "I'll congratulate them and leave." "No," he said, firm. "It's better if you don't come at all. Don't ruin this for your brother." I didn't ask him how a woman who'd served 20 years in uniform could ruin a party with her presence. I didn't ask why my service, something they'd once bragged about to neighbors, had suddenly become inconvenient. I just said, "All right." When the call ended, the kitchen felt too quiet. I stood there for a moment, staring at the crease in my dress, thinking about the garment bag in my trunk. Blue fabric, polished shoes, insignia I'd earned the slow way year after year. I hadn't planned to wear it. I never did for family events. I didn't want eyes on me. I wanted peace. I drove over anyway. Not to defy them, not to make a scene. I just wanted to drop off the gift, a simple silver frame Daniel had admired once, and wish him well. It felt wrong to disappear entirely, like I didn't exist. Their house glowed from the inside, warm light spilling through the windows. I could hear music, soft, tasteful, mixed with laughter. Cars lined the street, luxury sedans and SUVs that looked out of place in the neighborhood where we'd grown up. My mother met me at the door before I could knock. She looked past me, checking the room behind her. "Claire," she whispered sharply, "what are you doing here?" "I'm not staying," I said. "Just give this to Daniel." She took the gift from my hands as if it were something fragile. "This isn't appropriate," she said. "You're putting us in a terrible position." "By existing," I asked quietly. She flinched. "Please," she said, "go home." My father appeared behind her, already wearing his practiced smile. It dropped when he saw me. "We talked about this," he said. "You can't be here." I nodded once. Years in the army had taught me when a fight wasn't worth picking. "Congratulations," I said. "Tell Daniel I'm proud of him." I turned and walked back down the driveway, my breath fogging in the cold. Behind me, the door closed. The sound carried more weight than it should have. In my car, I sat with my hands on the steering wheel, staring at the house I'd grown up in. I thought about all the times my parents had said they were proud of my service, at least until it stopped being useful. I thought about Daniel, charming and easy, always knowing how to make people comfortable. And I thought about how often comfort had been valued over truth in my family. I drove a few blocks away and parked, unsure why I hadn't just gone home. The radio murmured a countdown to the evening's highlights. I turned it off and sat in silence. My phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. "Things are tense. I'm sorry, we'll talk later." Later. There was always a later. I opened the trunk and looked at the garment bag. I hadn't planned on touching it. I hadn't even considered bringing it inside. But something about the night the closed door, my father's voice had stirred an old familiar resolve. I didn't unzip the bag. I just closed the trunk again and leaned against the car, breathing in the cold air. Through the trees, I could see light spilling from my parents' living room. I imagined the guests inside people who knew my family only by the version they chose to present. People who would never guess there was a daughter standing outside deemed too risky to be seen. I didn't know yet that inside that house near the fireplace someone had placed a framed photograph on the mantel. I didn't know that a woman from that particular family would stop in front of it, lean closer, and feel her breath catch. All I knew was that I wasn't angry. I was steady. And steadiness I'd learned in uniform was what carried you through when everything else fell away. I didn't drive home right away. I sat there with the engine off, listening to the faint thump of music drifting through the neighborhood like a heartbeat I wasn't invited to share. The cold crept up through the soles of my shoes, and the steering wheel felt stiff beneath my palms. Somewhere inside that house, my brother was smiling for photos, clinking glasses, promising a future my parents could brag about. Somewhere inside that house, my parents were pretending I didn't exist. I've stood in formation while families waved flags and wiped their eyes. I've signed condolence letters with a pen that felt too light for the weight of what it carried. I've watched young soldiers steady their breathing before stepping into hard places. None of it prepared me for the way a closed front door can make you feel 13 again. The truth was, being too embarrassing wasn't new. It was just new in this particular packaging. When I was a kid, my mother used to smooth my hair too hard before church, tugging at my scalp like she could pull me into a more acceptable shape. "Stand up straight," she'd hiss. "Smile nicely." If I laughed too loud, she pinched my arm under the pew. If I asked a question at the dinner table that made my father look unsure, he'd clear his throat and say, "Claire, let's not." Daniel back then, Danny was different. He had that easy grin that made teachers forgive late homework, and neighbors slip him extra cookies. He learned early how to read a room, how to charm adults, how to make my father feel like a bigger man just by standing beside him. At family gatherings, my dad would clap Danny's shoulder and say, "That's my boy," and my mother would glance at me like I was a detail to be managed. I wasn't unlovable. I wasn't wild or reckless. I was just plain. Serious. The kind of child who listened more than she spoke. The kind who noticed things. My parents didn't know what to do with that. They preferred simple categories, the one who shines and the one who stays out of the way. By the time I was 18, I'd learned how to be invisible without disappearing. I'd learned to pour coffee for guests and laugh at the right places in my father's stories. I'd learned that in my family, harmony mattered more than truth, and appearances mattered more than the person inside them. The army didn't cure that ache, but it gave me a language for it. It taught me that discipline wasn't silence, it was choice. That you could hold your ground without raising your voice. That respect wasn't something you begged for. It was something you earned and protected. I joined straight out of high school. My father acted proud the day I signed my papers, but I could see the tension at the corners of his mouth. Pride for him always came with conditions. He liked telling people his daughter served. He liked the way it sounded at barbecues. But he didn't like what it meant, me leaving, me becoming someone he couldn't control, me answering to a chain of command that wasn't him. At first I came home on leave and tried to fit back into the old shape. I brought little gifts. I kept my stories short. I let my mother ask about uniforms and promotions like she was reading from a script. Daniel would brag about my service to his friends, then roll his eyes when I corrected a detail. "Relax, Claire," he'd say. "They don't care about the specifics." But I cared. The specifics were the work, the sweat, the years, the quiet cost. Sitting in my car outside my parents' house on the night of Daniel's engagement party, I realized something that made my chest feel both hollow and clear. My family liked the idea of me more than they liked me. They liked the symbol. They liked the story when it helped them. They didn't like the reality when it complicated their performance. My phone buzzed again, another text this time from my mother. "Please, just go home, don't do this. Don't do what exists in the same zip code as their guests." I didn't reply. I looked through the windshield at the dark line of trees. and thought about all the times I'd been asked to make myself smaller to keep someone else comfortable. I thought about how my father's voice had sounded on the phone, controlled, certain, like he was doing me a favor. I thought about the word he'd used, standards, as if dignity was something you inherited, not something you built. Then my phone rang. Daniel. I answered on the second ring. "Hey," I said. His voice came out in a rush, low and strained. "Where are you?" "Not inside," I replied. "Claire." He exhaled like he'd been holding his breath all night. "Mom told me you showed up." "I came to drop off the gift," I said. "I didn't come to cause trouble." "I know," he said. "It's just there are people here, her family, they're intense." "So are Mom and Dad," I said, not unkindly. He didn't laugh. "Look, I'm sorry," he said. "I should have handled this. I should have." He stopped, and I heard voices in the background, the clink of glass, a burst of laughter that sounded rehearsed. "What do you want me to do, Daniel?" I asked. He hesitated. "Just don't make a scene," he said, and the words came out soft, almost ashamed. I stared at the dashboard. "I've spent my entire life not making a scene," I said quietly. "It's kind of my specialty." There was silence on the line. When he spoke again, he sounded smaller. "I didn't mean it like that." "I know," I said. And I did. Daniel wasn't cruel. He was practiced. He had learned the family skill of survival, keep the peace, keep the image, keep moving. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said. "Sure," I replied. We hung up without solving anything. The house still glowed. The party still went on. And I still sat there a few blocks away in the cold with a garment bag in my trunk and a lifetime of being politely erased behind my ribs. I finally started the car and drove home, not because they'd told me to, but because I needed space to think. My apartment was dark and quiet when I walked in. I hung up my coat, kicked off my shoes, and poured a glass of water that tasted like nothing. The TV in the next apartment murmured through the wall, some New Year's special, a crowd cheering for a countdown I wasn't part of. I went to my bookshelf and found the old photo frame I kept there, a picture from years ago, a moment of service captured under harsh fluorescent lights. I stared at it for a long time, feeling the strange pressure of memory. People always talk about recognition like it's a reward. Sometimes it's a reckoning. Sometimes it's a door opening, whether you're ready or not. I didn't know yet that inside my parents' house someone had already stopped in front of a different framed photograph, the one they thought was harmless decor. I didn't know that a voice I hadn't heard in years was about to cut through their expensive music. But as I set my glass down and sat in the silence, I felt it anyway, a shift, subtle and inevitable. Because truth has a way of finding light. I woke before dawn the way I always did after a night that left something unfinished. My apartment was still dark, the city outside quiet in that brief pause before morning traffic remembered itself. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the heater, my mind replaying my father's voice, and the way my mother had refused to meet my eyes. I'd faced harder things than a family party, harder places, louder dangers. But this kind of exclusion had a way of slipping under your armor. I got up, pulled on running shoes, and went out into the cold. The streets were nearly empty, the air sharp enough to wake me fully. As I ran, my thoughts settled into the steady rhythm my body knew well. Breathe, step, breathe again. The army had taught me how to move forward when everything in you wanted to stop and ask why. When I got back, my phone showed 3 missed calls from an unknown number. No voicemail. I assumed it was nothing, spam, wrong number, the usual, and went about my morning. Shower, coffee, uniform inspection out of habit, even though I wasn't reporting anywhere that day. Civilian life had never quite erased the cadence. The phone rang again while I was tying my hair back. "Same number," I answered. "Is this Claire Morgan?" a woman asked. Her voice was calm, precise. "Yes," I said. "Who's calling?" "This is Margaret Whitfield," she replied. "I'm Daniel's fiance's mother." I closed my eyes just briefly. "All right," I said. "How can I help you?" There was a pause, thoughtful rather than awkward. "I believe I saw you last night," she said. "Or rather, I saw you in a photograph." My grip tightened on the phone. A photograph. "Yes," she said. "A framed picture near the fireplace. You were in uniform. Army." The lighting was harsh, but the face was unmistakable. My pulse picked up. I thought of the photograph my parents kept out only when it suited them, the one from years ago from a ceremony they'd attended briefly and left early. That could have been me, I said carefully. I know it was, Margaret replied, because I was there. The memory surfaced before I could stop it. A base auditorium years earlier. Folding chairs, polished floors, the smell of old coffee. A recognition ceremony for a joint operation that had gone badly before it went right. I'd stood at attention, eyes forward, medals heavy against my chest, thinking of the people who hadn't made it home. I hadn't noticed the civilians seated in the back, their faces drawn tight with worry and hope. My daughter was deployed, then, Margaret continued. She was injured. You were her commanding officer. The room seemed to tilt, I remember I said quietly. You stayed with her through the evacuation, Margaret said. You refused to leave until she was on that helicopter. I swallowed. That was my job. She exhaled, the sound almost a laugh. You always say that, even back then. Silence stretched between us, not uncomfortable, just full of years. I didn't recognize you last night until I saw the photo, she said. But once I did, I couldn't unsee it. And I couldn't understand why you weren't in the room. I was asked not to be, I replied. Her voice cooled, not with anger but clarity. By your parents. Yes. I see, she said. And somehow the way she said it made me feel like she truly did. She didn't ask for details. She didn't press. She simply said, I would like to speak with you in person if you're willing. I hesitated, then nodded to myself. All right. We agreed to meet that afternoon at a quiet cafe not far from my apartment. When I arrived, Margaret was already there, seated by the window. She looked older than she had in my memory, but the eyes were the same sharp, observant kind without being soft. She stood when she saw me. It's good to see you again, General, she said. The title landed with weight. Claire is fine, I replied. She smiled faintly. Old habits. We sat and she folded her hands neatly on the table. I want to be clear, she said. This isn't about gratitude. That debt was settled long ago. This is about honesty. I nodded. My family values discretion, she continued, but we value integrity more. Last night I watched people work very hard to curate an image, and I watched you be excluded from it. I didn't want to cause trouble, I said. You didn't, she replied. Your absence did. She leaned back slightly. There will be a formal engagement dinner next week. Extended family, friends, people who matter to us. I expect you to attend. I met her gaze. My parents may not agree. They will, she said calmly. I'll speak with them. I felt a flicker of unease. I don't want to embarrass anyone. Margaret's expression softened. Claire, she said embarrassment comes from deceit, not from truth. When we parted, she touched my arm briefly. You led my daughter when she was at her most vulnerable, she said. You didn't hide her. You didn't diminish her. I won't allow that to be done to you. I walked home afterward, the winter sun pale overhead, my thoughts steady and clear. My phone buzzed as I reached my building. A text from my mother. We need to talk. Please call. I didn't respond, not yet. Inside my apartment, I stood by the window and looked out at the street below. Somewhere my parents were scrambling to regain control of a narrative that had slipped beyond them. Somewhere my brother was trying to balance loyalty and comfort. And somewhere a truth they'd tried to tuck into a frame on the wall was stepping out on its own. I didn't know how the next dinner would unfold. I didn't know what my parents would say when confronted. But I knew this, I wasn't walking into it to prove anything. I was walking in because I'd earned my place whether they liked it or not. And that at last felt like enough. My mother called again that evening. This time I answered. Claire, she said, and the way she said my name told me everything had shifted. Where have you been all day? Living my life, I replied, the same way I always do. She exhaled a thin sound. Margaret Whitfield called us. I leaned against the kitchen counter, the cool surface grounding me. I assumed she would. She asked questions, my mother said, very direct questions. About me. About why you weren't at Daniel's engagement party, she answered. About why we thought it was acceptable to keep you away. I closed my eyes. I could picture it clearly, Margaret's steady gaze, the polite tone that left no room to hide. And what did you tell her? There was a pause. Your father said you weren't feeling well. I didn't react. That wasn't true. I know, my mother said quietly. But he panicked. Panicking didn't make him say what he said to me, I replied. That was a choice. Silence stretched between us. Then softer, she invited you to the engagement dinner. I know, I said. My mother's breath caught. She went directly to you. Yes. That's unusual, she said, as if the word could soften the implication. It's honest, I replied. My father's voice joined the call then, firm and strained. You didn't have to involve her. I said. I didn't involve anyone. I was asked. You know how this looks, he said. People will talk. They already are, I replied, just not in the way you planned. He didn't answer that. Instead, he said, you need to be careful. The warning might have worked once, years ago, before deployments and command decisions and nights where lives rested on whether I held steady. I've been careful my entire career, I said. This isn't care. This is fear. My father went quiet. My mother spoke again, her voice tight. We want you to come, she said, to the dinner. But, quietly, no uniform, no speeches, just blend in. There it was, the condition. I'm not coming to blend, I replied. I'm coming to be present. That's exactly what we're worried about, my father said. I know, I said, and that's why this matters. The call ended without resolution. The days leading up to the dinner moved slowly. I went to work, answered emails, reviewed reports. Routine steadied me. Command had taught me that uncertainty doesn't disappear. If you avoid it, it waits. Better to walk toward it with your shoulders squared. The night of the engagement dinner arrived cold and clear. I dressed simply but with intention. Civilian dress again, dark and tailored. The uniform stayed in its garment bag, pressed and ready not as a weapon, not as a statement, just as truth waiting if it was needed. The Whitfields' home was understated elegance. No excess, no show. Guests moved through the space with easy confidence, greeting one another without checking reflections. Margaret met me at the door, her smile genuine. I'm glad you came, she said. So am I replied, surprised by how much I meant it. My parents arrived shortly after. My mother's eyes flicked to me, then away. My father nodded stiffly, his jaw set. Daniel hovered between us, caught in the gravity of it all. Margaret introduced me without flourish. This is Claire, she said to a small circle nearby. She served as a commanding officer during my daughter's deployment. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. People straightened. Questions followed, measured, respectful. I answered briefly, redirecting attention where it belonged. I didn't need to explain myself. The facts did that on their own. Dinner was served. Conversation flowed. At one point, I felt my mother watching me, her expression torn between relief and dread. My father barely touched his plate. After dessert, Margaret stood and tapped her glass lightly. The room quieted. Family, she began, is often presented as something perfect, polished, predictable. But in my experience, it's defined less by appearances and more by character, especially when that character is tested. Her gaze found me. Some people serve quietly, she continued. They don't ask to be seen. They don't demand recognition. But their absence is felt when truth is missing. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was attentive. My father stood then, abruptly enough to draw eyes. He looked around the room, then at me. For a moment I thought he might retreat. Instead, he cleared his throat. This is my daughter, he said. The words sounded unfamiliar, like a language he hadn't practiced. Claire. She's served our country with honor. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't forgiveness, but it was public, and it mattered. I met his gaze and nodded once. No smile, no tears, just acknowledgement. The rest of the evening unfolded quietly. When it was time to leave, Margaret walked me to the door. You handled that cleanly, she said. I learned from the army, I replied. She smiled. And from yourself. Outside, the night air was sharp. I breathed it in, feeling grounded. This wasn't over, not entirely. But the truth had been spoken, and it stood without needing me to defend it. The morning after the engagement dinner, I woke to a quiet that felt earned. Not relief, not victory, just the steady absence of dread. Sunlight edged its way across the bedroom wall, pale and deliberate, and for the first time since New Year's Eve, my chest didn't tighten at the thought of my family. My phone buzzed once on the nightstand, a message from Daniel. Thank you for coming. I know that wasn't easy. I stared at the words for a moment before replying. I came because it mattered. A few minutes later, another message followed. Dad hasn't said much, but he's thinking. I set the phone down. Thinking was a start. In my line of work, it usually came after something had gone wrong and before someone decided whether to learn from it. I went about my day the way I always did. Morning run, coffee black, emails answered in precise order. Habit is a kind of anchor, especially when emotions try to drift. By midday, word had begun to travel not loudly, not in the way gossip does, but through the quiet channels that carry real weight. A colleague stopped by my office and said, I heard your name mentioned at a dinner last night. Another added, small world. I nodded and changed the subject. I wasn't interested in managing a story. I'd learned long ago that the moment you try to control a narrative, it starts controlling you. That afternoon my mother called. I answered. I don't know how to say this, she began. You can just say it, I replied. She hesitated. Your father hasn't slept. I leaned back in my chair. Neither did I for a long time. She pressed on. He keeps replaying things, what he said, what he didn't say. That's on him, I said gently. I know, she replied, but he's struggling. There was a time when that would have pulled me back into the old role, soothing, accommodating, making myself smaller, so someone else could feel better. That time had passed. Struggling doesn't erase choices, I said. It just reveals them. She was quiet, then asked, Will you come by on Sunday, just the three of us? I considered it. Not because I owed them, but because clarity doesn't avoid hard conversations. All right, I said, but I'm not coming to be managed. I understand, she replied. I wasn't sure she did, but she wanted to. Sunday arrived cold and bright. I drove to my parents' house without rushing, without rehearsing. When I walked in, the living room looked the same, carefully arranged photos aligned. One thing was different. The framed photograph near the fireplace, the one Margaret had recognized, was gone. My father stood when he saw me. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just stood there, hands at his sides, like a man unsure what posture fit the moment. Sit, he said, gesturing to the couch. I did. He didn't start right away. He paced once, then stopped. I told myself I was protecting Daniel, he said. Protecting the family. From what I asked. He exhaled. Judgment. From people who decide your worth in a glance. I nodded, and you decided mine the same way. He winced. Yes. The word landed harder than any excuse would have. Margaret told me what you did for her daughter, he continued. The nights you stayed, the decisions you made. I was her commanding officer, I said. It was my responsibility. And you never thought to tell us, he said, not accusing, just stating. It didn't seem relevant, I replied. You'd already decided who I was. My mother shifted in her chair. We were afraid, she said. Afraid that if people saw you, they'd ask questions we couldn't answer. That's not fear, I said. That's control. My father sank into the armchair opposite me. I was wrong, he said quietly. Not just about the party, about years. I waited. Silence is a tool. I'd learned when to use it. I measured success by how things looked, he continued. And when you didn't fit the picture I tried to crop you out. The honesty cost him. I could see it in the way his shoulders slumped. I won't be cropped, I said. Not again. He nodded. I know. It wasn't an apology wrapped in theatrics. It was a correction spoken plainly. In my world, that mattered. When I left, the door stayed open behind me, not symbolically, just open. That evening, Margaret called. I wanted you to hear this from me, she said. I spoke with your parents again. And I asked. They listened, she replied. That doesn't guarantee change, but it opens the door. I'm not chasing guarantees, I said. She smiled through the phone. Of course you aren't. The next week brought the change of command ceremony on base, a long-scheduled event I couldn't miss. The morning was crisp flags snapping in the wind. I stood at the podium in dress uniform insignia, catching the light, the band's notes clean and precise. Families filled the seats, cameras ready, children fidgeting. I spoke briefly, clear words. Recognition where it was due. No flourish, no performance. Leadership doesn't need it. Afterward, as I stepped down to greet families, I saw him at the back of the crowd. My father. No suit this time. Sports coat a size too big, hands shoved into his pockets like he wasn't sure where they belonged. When he reached me, he didn't hesitate. He stood straight and said loud enough for the people nearby to hear, "This is my daughter, General Claire Morgan." No qualifiers, no explanations, just the truth. I nodded and extended my hand. He took it, his grip firm, eyes steady. We didn't hug. We didn't need to. As he stepped aside, I felt something settle, not forgiveness, not closure, but alignment. The truth had been spoken where it counted. Publicly. Cleanly. That night, driving home with the windows cracked, the hum of the road steady beneath me, I realized something simple. Dignity doesn't arrive when people finally approve of you. It arrives when you stop waiting for them to. And for the first time, I wasn't waiting. After the change of command ceremony, life didn't suddenly soften into something cinematic. There were no long apologies, no dramatic reversals, no family group texts filled with heart emojis. What came instead was quieter and heavier. The kind of weight that settles when people realize something cannot be unsaid. At work, nothing changed. That mattered to me more than I expected. I walked the same corridors, returned the same salutes, sat through the same briefings where lives were discussed in terms of logistics and responsibility. Young officers still knocked on my door with nervous energy, asking questions they pretended were procedural but were really about confidence. Enlisted soldiers still watched what I did more than what I said. The Army has a way of keeping you honest. It doesn't care about family politics or social embarrassment. It cares about whether you show up steady when it counts. But outside the base, ripples continued. The engagement dinner had been noticed. Not loudly, not in headlines, but in conversations that happened behind closed doors among families who understood reputation not as something flashy, but as something earned slowly and lost quickly. Margaret called one afternoon to check in. "I wanted you to know," she said, "that people asked questions after the ceremony." I smiled faintly. They always do. "They weren't the kind your parents fear," she added. "They were the kind that come with respect." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the neat stack of reports on my desk. "Respect doesn't need defending," I said. "No," she agreed, "it only needs consistency." My mother called later that week, not to argue, not to justify, just to talk. "I saw the pictures," she said, "from the ceremony." "Daniel sent them," I replied. She hesitated. "You looked right, like you were exactly where you belonged." I let that sit. I said. She sighed. "I don't know when we started believing belonging had rules. I almost answered when you were afraid, but I didn't. Growth doesn't respond well to accusation. You can unlearn it," I said instead. She was quiet for a long moment. "I'm trying," she said. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't nothing. The wedding plans moved forward. I wasn't involved in the details, and I didn't need to be. Invitations were sent. Seating charts adjusted. My name appeared where it should have always been without discussion. Daniel called the night before the rehearsal dinner. "I want you there," he said. "Not as a compromise, as my sister." "I'll be there," I replied. The rehearsal dinner was small and informal, held at a quiet restaurant with soft lighting and real conversation. When I arrived, there was no hesitation at the door, no sideways glances. My parents greeted me like someone who belonged, not perfectly, not comfortably, but honestly. During dessert, Margaret stood and raised her glass. Before we finished, she said, "I want to acknowledge something." The room stilled, not in tension, but in attention. "There are people who build families through visibility," she continued, "and people who build them through service. Both matter. But the second kind often goes unseen." She turned toward me. "Tonight I want to thank someone who taught my daughter what leadership looks like under pressure." I felt every eye turn. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I simply met her gaze. My father cleared his throat. "I'd like to add something," he said, standing. His voice wasn't strong, but it was steady. I spent too many years confusing image with honor. He looked directly at me. "I won't do that again." The words were simple. They didn't undo decades, but they corrected the record in front of the people who mattered most to him. That was enough. Afterward, as people lingered and talked in low voices, an older man approached me, a friend of the Whitfields, a retired officer. He extended his hand. "You held your line," he said quietly. "Not everyone can do that when it's personal." I shook his hand firmly. "I learned from watching good leaders," I replied. He nodded, and being one. Later that night, back in my apartment, I removed my jacket and sat in the familiar quiet. I thought about how close I'd come for years to believing my parents' discomfort was my responsibility. How easy it would have been to keep shrinking, to keep stepping back so other people could feel taller. I understood now that dignity isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It waits patient, unyielding until someone tries to move it aside. And when it stands, it doesn't shout. It just doesn't move. The wedding day arrived without fanfare in my mind, not because it wasn't important, but because the hardest part had already passed. What remained was simply showing up clean, steady, without armor. I dressed early, the house quiet around me, civilian clothes again. Nothing that drew attention, nothing that apologized. I checked my reflection once, not for approval, but for alignment. The woman looking back at me wasn't waiting to be accepted. She was already standing where she belonged. The ceremony was held in late spring, the air mild, the light soft enough to forgive everyone. White chairs lined the lawn. Families murmured to one another. Somewhere a string quartet tuned instruments with careful patience. When I arrived, no one stopped me. No one whispered. I took my seat near the front, exactly where my name had been placed on the card. No negotiations, no side conversations required. My parents sat a few rows ahead. My mother turned when she heard me approach and gave a small nod. My father met my eyes and held them just long enough to acknowledge what had been corrected. The ceremony was simple. Daniel looked nervous, sincere in a way I hadn't seen before. His fiancée smiled with a calm confidence that came from knowing who she was without needing to announce it. When they exchanged vows, I listened not as an observer measuring family dynamics, but as a sister who had finally been allowed to exist without conditions. After the applause faded, people rose and began to mingle. Congratulations passed easily. Hands were shaken, glasses were raised. More than once someone approached me and said some version of the same thing I've heard about you. Not said with curiosity, said with respect. I accepted it quietly. Respect doesn't need to be collected. It settles on you when you stop stepping out of its way. During the reception, my father stood to speak. He didn't tell stories meant to impress. He didn't inflate the moment. He talked about family as something learned, not inherited, about mistakes that take time to see clearly, about pride that comes from watching your children stand on their own even when it challenges you. Then he said it plain steady without drama. I have 2 children, he said, and I'm proud of both of them. He didn't look at the crowd when he said it. He looked at me. I didn't smile, I didn't cry, I nodded once. That was enough. Later, as the evening thinned and guests drifted toward the edge of the celebration, Margaret came to stand beside me. You know, she said most people would have forced a moment. I know, I replied. You didn't, she said. That's why it lasted. As the night wound down, I stepped outside for air. The music softened behind me. The sky was clear stars sharp against the dark. I thought about New Year's Eve, about the cold driveway, the closed door, the way my father's voice had sounded when he told me I would embarrass them. I thought about how close I'd come over the years to believing him. But the truth had a longer memory than fear. It waited in photographs, in service, in quiet choices made when no one was watching. And when it finally stood up in the room, it didn't need permission. It only needed space. I left the wedding without lingering. Not because I didn't belong, but because I no longer needed to prove that I did. Driving home, the road hummed beneath my tires, steady and familiar, the kind of sound you trust. Here's what I know now. If you've ever been told you were inconvenient, too different, too much of a risk to someone else's image, don't let that be the story you live in. People who fear judgment will always ask others to shrink first. You don't owe them that. Stand clean, stand steady, let the truth do the talking. And if this story found you, if you've carried something similar in your own family, I'd like to hear from you. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. We share these stories so no one has to feel invisible in their silence. We have many more stories like this to share about quiet strength, dignity, and the moments that change us. If you want to continue this journey with us, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next.